Lesley Roessing, former middle school teacher, literacy coach, director of a national writing project site, and avid reader of middle grade and young adult novels. In the United States, 2.7 million children have a parent who is incarcerated, and more than 5 million children, 7% of all United States children, have had a parent in prison or jail at some point. Today, the parents of 1 out of every 50 children in the United States are in prison. It's essential for children to be able to see their lives reflected in books, appreciating those stories as mirrors, valuing their struggles, and acknowledging their resilience. They can also employ those stories as maps to help them navigate their lives. But it is equally vital for readers to see the lives of those who they may see as different from themselves, their classmates and peers who are experiencing these challenges. That helps them gain understanding and compassion, using stories as windows into the lives of others. Today, thanks to perceptive, empathetic authors, novels with these unforgettable characters are available for school, classroom, community, and home readers. Today, I'm honored to present 4 of my favorite authors who have written novels about children affected by parental incarceration. We will talk to Janae Marks, author From the Desk of Zoe Washington, the story of an aspiring baker whose father is in prison. Zoe and her father reconnect on her 12th birthday through letters. We'll talk to Leslie Connor, author of All Rise for the Honorable Perry T. Cook, a young boy who lives in prison with his mother, who is an inmate and is hiding a secret. We have Padma Venkatraman, whose newest novel, Born Behind Bars, features a young Indian boy who was born in prison and lives there with his mother. When he turns 9, he is released to the streets, where a teenage girl helps him navigate the streets and learn about life. And last, we have Nora Baskin, Raleigh, author of Ruby on the Outside. Ruby is a young girl who lives with her aunt and visits her mother on the inside. Her secret makes her wary of making friends. So I have some questions for these authors. And the first question is, that I will throw out, is what made you decide to write a novel about parental incarceration? Janae?
Sure. Hi. So I actually sort of fell into this topic because I was inspired by a podcast, the podcast Serial, which is spelled S-E-R-I-A-L. The first season of that told the story of this man who is in prison still for murder, and a lot of people believe he was innocent. And so the podcast sort of went behind the scenes and sort of investigated a lot of this case and really kind of showed that there are a lot of holes in this story. And as I was listening to this, it just kind of got me thinking about wrongful convictions, that side of things. And so I started doing research there and, learned about the Innocence Project, which is this organization that helps overturn these kinds of cases. And since I like writing for young readers, the books that I'd written before this were young adult novels that did not get published. But I automatically started thinking about it from the point of view of a child. What would it be like to have a parent in this position? A lot of times there's these podcasts and documentaries about these kinds of situations, but you don't always hear from the family members. So I immediately went to that place of thinking about it from the point of view of the kid. So I kind of fell into that topic of having a parent in prison and the parental incarceration side of things.
Leslie.
Yeah, same question. Janae, that is a really great resource, actually, listening to a podcast. So before I started All Rise for the Honorable Perry T. Cook, I had learned that the statistic that you just heard Lesley Roessing say, which is what my author's note says is 1 in 28 children, experience having their parents incarcerated. And I thought about that in the classroom. So that was the first little tidbit that fell into my ear and stayed there. And then the other thing for me was a New York Times article about a woman named Judy Clark, who had been incarcerated some 30 years before I was reading the article, and who had left a little daughter on the outside. And Judy had gone through enormous changes during her incarceration, had become, someone who was deeply respected by both staff and fellow inmates in her situation. But that little girl left outside, she was raised by her grandparents, and every opportunity those grandparents had, they brought that little kid to see her parent. And so I got very interested in what's it like to parent from behind bars? What's that separation feel like? And so whereas I, used no parts of her story particularly, that was that first little seed for me.
Padma?
Hi. So with Born Behind Bars, which I can't hold up because I have to say this, I'm coming to you all from the edge of the Arctic. This is so cool. Thanks, Lesley. Born Behind Bars actually started when I read a newspaper article. This was a long time ago, and it was actually covered by the BBC. And there was this article about a young boy who had been born in jail, not prison. So there's a difference. Lesley pointed that out in the beginning. Jail is where you go before you have a trial, and prison is where you go if you have been if you get a sentence against you. So if you have actually received at least a trial, however flawed. And this boy spent his whole life in jail, because his mother had not even had a chance to stand trial. And this is unfortunately something that happens in India. And when I came as a naive young student of color, the only female of color in my entire graduate class, and that was my introduction to the United States, I had this marvelous professor, Bob Diaz. And in his categorical data analysis class, which is a way to look at numbers, he showed us that a man who is Black is much more likely to be wrongfully incarcerated. And just seeing those numbers right there, was so important to me. And I think that stayed with me as well. And those two things came together in the story of this boy who had been born in India like I was, and had just had such a horrible experience. And then suddenly was, chucked out onto the streets, and his mother remained behind bars.
Nora?
Yeah, hi. It's a serious topic, so I guess we're not going to be afraid to get serious. I came to this subject having gone to a fundraiser that my college roommate invited me to. I knew nothing about it. It was an organization called Rehabilitation Through the Arts. And I went for the free lunch, right? I didn't know anything about it. But when the speakers started speaking, the woman who ran the organization and a formerly incarcerated person, I started learning things I was ashamed to find out I didn't know, really ashamed. One was that Sing Sing was 20 minutes from where I was living and completely hidden from me. I mean, I sort of knew it was there, but that's very intentional, that the prisons are kept secret from us. We don't know what's going on in there. And then I started learning some other facts about our judicial system, about social reform, about bail reform, mandatory sentencing. And again, the statistics that everyone's bringing up were staggering, were so horrific. And for me, when I heard of the number of incarcerated people in the United States, men and women, like Janae said, it struck me that if there's that many adults in prison, there are that many children without parents. And then the story became very personal
to me, literally sitting at that fundraiser, because my mother committed suicide when I was 3. And although I've written stories about that, all my novels are somewhat autobiographical. They're all about a girl growing up without a mother in some level. This struck me in a way, in a very different way, in a very connected way. Because now you have a mother who's done something wrong, something bad, that affects her child for the rest of her life, which my mother's actions did. There's a stigma. There is a shame. It's not something I could mourn or talk about. It's hidden. I was lied to about it, which many children whose parents are incarcerated are also lied to, which is very destructive. And yet, the ability to reconcile your love for your mother and your mother's love for you, it for me was impossible because my mother was gone, but for these children it was still possible. And I was immediately said, I need to write this story. And right there at that fundraiser, I spoke to people. Who could I talk to? In fact, and I got myself into the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility, which is where Judy Clark is. And was, yes. She was at the time. She was still there then. And I just started, doing research and meeting people. And it changed my life. Because ever since I wrote that book, I've been volunteering and working in the prison. So it was life-changing.
Yeah. Could you each tell us a little bit about the characters and anything in the plot that you'd like to share with future readers? We could start with Lesley.
Oh, sure. So, it's Perry Cook. That's my character. I think that my book might be a little bit, well, in one way in which it's different from the other 4 is that I took a greater liberty. Padma tells of a true situation that happens, in another country. Here in the United States, I know of no boy who was ever raised, started off his life in a prison. But one of the research pieces for me was finding out that there are women's prisons where if an inmate, someone goes in pregnant, they can have, they might give birth to their baby there. And if they qualify, a nonviolent offender may actually have access to a prison nursery and be able to raise her child and keep that child with her for a certain number of years. It's usually less than 2 years. Then the child either goes into the foster system or with family. And one of the reasons is this is a great incentive for that person to correct the mistakes they've made in their life and move forward for the sake of that child. Hopefully that bond is that powerful. So in teeny tiny Surprise, Nebraska, which is also, a real place, but I planted a prison there. That's what happened with Perry. I mean, a very sort of, independently operating warden decided that this young woman who gave birth to her son there, should be able to raise him there. But of course, Perry was not locked up. He went out for the day. And in fact, some of the other residents of the co-ed correctional facility would say, he's our man on the outside. He would bring back news and whatnot of what was going on the outside, because of course he was having an education there. But then coming home to his parents, and the thing I wanted to kind of portray was a child who really did, who really saw his mother as a parent, a good parent, and that he also made family out of those others who were around him, which some people can think of as, these, cold-hardened criminals. Well, that's not always true. And he would see the good in them and that kind of thing. So that was kind of where I was coming from with this story, a little unusual bent. And I always think, it's never happened. And yet, we hear such wild things every day that I'm still holding out the thought that we could actually hear a true story about that same thing. But of course, what Perry wants us to be with his mother, and the rub comes when a new district attorney in town says, wait, there's an 11-year-old boy living in prison. Oh, no, not under my watch. And he pulls him out and actually fosters him under his roof. So it's like living with the enemy. And yet that character, too, I think is very interesting as the antagonist. He's really very two-sided. And so, there's a lot about justice and a lot about forgiveness, I think, in all of these books. And same here. My business was to present not necessarily an absolutely true story or true sounding story, but to get to the emotional heart of what it is to be separated by the system that can really, mistreat a lot of people.
If I remember correctly, he was a very upbeat character, though.
Yeah, he is. He's a quiet, polite boy. And of course, he's grown up with rules, and he's grown up around adults who have rules, which is an interesting thing, I think. But when he gets desperate enough and when he has to, he puts his cleverness, to the test. And finds that he actually has some agency. I mean, I think that's a common thing with middle grade. We talk about, one of the common things is that, the middle grade character, the problem for them is either that the parents are in charge of everything, or the adults are in charge of everything, or they should be. So that's one of the things I always play off of on every book, I think. Who's in charge?
Interesting. Nora? Tell us a little bit about Ruby.
Yeah, well, Ruby's mom was incarcerated for a violent drug crime when Ruby was 5, and she's serving 25 years, which I chose to touch on some really terrible injustices in our system, flaws, I think, because the boyfriend who actually committed the crime had information to use for a plea bargain, and he got a much lighter sentence. The mother didn't have any information, and that, it was all from my research. I actually didn't make any of the crimes up that I reference in the book, that the other children visiting their parents, I took them all from the newspaper. So Ruby's living with her aunt, who she calls Ma Tu, like Ma Tu, but people hear it as Ma Tu. And Ruby is, I'll just share with you something. Ruby's journey is to learn to forgive her mother and to accept her mother's love, and for her mother to recognize that a mother behind bars is still a mother, and that her role is valuable and important. And many of the women I met do not feel that. They don't see that value. So if anything, my book, when it's read by women in prison, it touches me so much to hear how they recognize their value. I would have given anything to hear my mother say, "I love you," right? That's invaluable. But I will tell you, when I started writing the book, I was going to base her on me, because I just told you my story. I was going to have her have a mother who did this bad thing, blah, 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 and how she was growing up, which, if I had made her about me, would have meant she got in trouble, she got suspended, she got bad grades, she was just a handful and had a very difficult childhood. But I went to start researching the book, and I went to an organization called Our Children, which is in Queens, and connects mothers and children in the hours before incarceration, during, and after incarceration. Our, H-O-U-R, a shout out to them. And I met a woman named Kelly Fallon, who hooked me up with a reading group so I could have kids vet the story. And I did something a writer never does. I think you guys will agree. I asked Kelly before I wrote the book, I said, is there anything you don't want or want in this story? Like, I never want to hear anybody's input on my character, on my story. But I made this, that one time I did. And she said, by the way, yes. And she said, it gives me kind of goosebumps. She said, please, I'm actually going to choke up. She said, please do not make your main character a bad kid who gets in trouble, which is what I was planning on doing. Because she said the biggest stigma these kids face, the biggest hardship they face, is that people assume that they're going to be bad like their parent, bad. And I heard her, and I said, I won't. And so Ruby is a very well-adjusted. She's happy. She's having, she doesn't want to talk about what happened to her mom because she herself hasn't reconciled it. But when she does, nobody really cares that much. You know, it's just another story in the world of stories, but she needs to reconcile it. And she has a loving caretaker, you know, and things that I didn't have, but that's Ruby's journey. And I think the only characters are Ruby, her best friend Margalit, and her Matu and her mom, who's in prison, and then various extraneous people, like peripheral people she meets. So it has a happy, hopeful ending.
Yeah, I was really happy when she got this new best friend who was very supportive and,
Yes,
you know.
all we need, right? Everyone just needs that one best friend.
Absolutely. Janae,
Sure.
yours is a little different because Zoe doesn't connect with her father until she's 12, so it's a little different.
So right. So this was a different approach. In this case, because he went to prison when her mom was pregnant with her, and when her parents were pretty young, like he was only 18 years old. Her mom, you know, once he went to prison, her mom kind of just, you know, did not really make an effort to keep in touch with him, have that relationship with her daughter. So she kind of never really had that relationship until she, you know, unexpectedly receives this letter on her 12th birthday from him. And then she decides, I want to write back and I want to get to know him this way. So there's already that sense of like meeting a parent and reconnecting with them for the first time and wanting to kind of reclaim some of that lost time through the letters. But also there's a little bit of a mystery because she, you know, she thinks that he's guilty of this crime. That's what she's known her whole life. Her mom thinks, you know, everybody's thinking he's guilty. But then she finds out in one of his letters that he actually, you know, he says he's innocent. And so she's like, is that true? Do I trust him? Or is he lying to me? So she just needs to, that's when it becomes, you know, she wants to find out the truth. So, yeah, so it's a different story. I think mainly because I think being inspired by that podcast and how even when listening to that, you don't know for sure whether or not this person is innocent or guilty because they're still trying. There was no resolution at the end of that podcast, while there is more of a resolution in this book. So there was that sense of mystery that was really intriguing to me, and so I kind of wanted to incorporate that in there. But yeah, I think you still get some of that feelings of that some of the other characters in these books share of, you know, what it's like to have a parent in prison, even if it's in a different, you know, situation. Yeah, and then. Yeah.
I was going to say, and here I am butting into your story, but one thing I loved was that she was, you know, an aspiring baker, and then they connected through his recipes.
Yeah, so that was another thing. I think with some of the tough themes, again, one thing I didn't mention, you know, what Padma mentioned earlier about how, you know, Black men are historically like much more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a crime. That was definitely something I wanted to address in the story. And, you know, those are some tough themes and things that Zoe's having to think about. So I also wanted to have some lightness. That's why I decided to add the baking and, you know, and other ways that they can connect. And so, you know, they would connect over the baking and they connect over the music, you know, so there's other happy moments in the story. And I think that's always good too. Like sort of what Nora was saying, it doesn't have to, just because you have a parent in prison doesn't have to define you as a person. You can still have a great, happy life. I wanted to show that, like that, even though she grew up without this paternal, you know, this father, she does have a stepfather now, but even still, you know, like she still has a, you know, she still has an okay life. And that can be the case for all sorts of other kids in this situation.
Padma, your characters, I found just, you know, just have stayed with me. I mean, I've just read the book, but, you know, all these characters, probably as much or if not more so than a lot of books I've read, have stayed with me.
Thank you. And I'm feeling really emotional because sometimes there are things you don't see. And sometimes when you hear people speak, you suddenly see them. And when I was hearing Nora speak, and I was listening, you know, Janae, you know, I love your book. And Lesley knows I love her book. And Nora knows I love her book. And Lesley said something which is so important to me, which is, you know, how she made, and I loved Perry, but I also loved the person that she calls her antagonist because he's so real and so complex as well. And the first, you know, when I saw Lesley's cover, which I'd read her other books and loved them, and read Perry. And when I saw the cover, it shocked me and it scared me so much because I saw this boy almost, of course, my boy was Indian, but the cover showed what I had kind of sort of pictured, which was this very different looking little Indian boy looking out and seeing through the cell, the little cell. He was seeing the sky. And, you know, to me, when I heard his voice, I thought he was a different boy, and I didn't make the connection until just now when Nora said something. And there's something I've never said before and never say in writing because it affects so many people. But and I know, Janae, you said kids might listen, and I will say this, whatever it takes, whenever I visit a school, because my father was jailed. And he didn't go to prison, but he was in jail. So I turned out to be a pretty good kid, I think. Some people might disagree. But you know what? I think it's so important. I think it's so important for kids to know that you are not defined by who your parents are. And in my father's case, he was a very complex person. He was like I think all of our people are complex. And in my case, I wonder, I don't know, but I wonder if he was just so charming. He was immensely charming, charismatic person. And I think he probably deserved to be in prison, but didn't get there. He was in jail and he was released. And that's something that my family would never speak about, but I have never spoken about because it's something that's buried so deeply. Mm-hmm. And I think if this book allows me to do one thing, if it allows me to change one child's life, to say you're not defined by that. Because I was scared all my life. I was even scared to have my own child because I was so frightened somehow that I would pass on something that was bad and that I would be a cruel person to this child somehow. Mm-hmm. So
you're not alone in that feeling at all. You're not alone and I think the reason our books are so important is to raise that stigma. And if you look throughout history or American history, every time we've addressed an issue with stigma and lifted it, the healing and the dangerous repercussions of it are, lessened. So thank you. I mean, my heart goes out to you. I just had to say that.
Thank you. And I do want to say one more thing, which is I feel like I've been talking about Kabir so much, and the Kodava girl that you see in the novel is somebody that she shows up briefly. By the way, a bookstore in the Faroes had my book, so I do have a copy of the Bridge Home, and so like one of the kids in the Bridge Home is based on this girl, but it's like very briefly, and she was Kaurava, so she was from the Roma community in India, and I felt like I hadn't really done her service in the Bridge Home, so I made another character who's inspired by her, who is the one that you see, who is the kid, the friend that Kabir meets when he gets on the street, who helps him out.
She becomes his guide. Yeah. Because he's lived 9 years in the jail, so he's when he is kicked out of prison, kicked out of jail, he has to have a guide, and she becomes his guide. But what I loved about her is how she said, I could dress differently and fit in and not have people look down on me because of my caste, but I don't want to. She really wants to preserve her family's culture. So there's some of that in there too. The pride, I think in all these characters, the pride in their parents shows through.
Lesley, I just because Padma's gone to that place, it's so intense when she says the children aren't, how did you phrase it? Carry the sins of their parents, or however you phrased it. I think it's also important. I'm gonna get it wrong. Brian Stevenson, who writes also for the parents, you are not the worst thing you've ever done. You are not only the worst thing you've ever done.
Related to that, if I can jump in, one of the pieces of research that amazed me and like Nora used the word, made me feel sort of ashamed that I didn't know it at the time is it's kind of amazing when you go and you look who is in our minimum security facilities. Their so-called crimes read a lot more like mistakes to me. And I mention that because as I would read these chapters to my critique group before this book was a book, they would, we would all just like, put our heads in our hands and say, there, but for the grace go I, because we just, God, what have I done that with just a little twist on it could have gotten me into such trouble that I couldn't claw out of. And, in my case, I think with this book, with my story, it was the matter of a confession that really that comes into question, because these things can be coerced and related to that. I could not believe the number of actual case stories that I read about where I was looking at women mostly, where women got in trouble because of something that a man had them do. So, that's a cautionary note right there. So,
I think that's shown in Nora's book. Ruby's mother. She takes full responsibility, but she was, the bystander.
Right.
But I don't know if we have touched on this. My next question is going to be, each of your novels presents a different perspective of parental incarceration. We have Ruby, who's visiting her mother in prison. We have Perry, who's living with his mother. We have Kabir, who lives the first 9 years with his mother, and a host of other interesting characters. And Zoe, who corresponds with her father in prison. I don't know if we covered this completely, but I was going to ask how you made the decision to develop your story through that lens. Either the within or the without.
I think I'm just going to jump in first to say I'll skip that question a little bit because I think I did and I went on and on too long. So leave me out of this one.
Okay.
Or just briefly.
Four characters. We have 2 inside the prison and 2 outside.
Yeah. I can comment on that actually, because I really got to thinking about something. So for me, if you remember, I said that that Perry ends up hauled out of the prison, which felt like a home to him, and he is put into foster care where everything is new and different, and in some ways feels more like a prison. So this is an odd trade. And so that was something that just kind of, this is the beautiful thing about writing, all this stuff sort of falls into the hopper, and then you see what wants to become highlighted as you write. And that for me was a really big piece. What is home? How do we define home? And, it's really, is it more about feeling or is it more about place? And of course I know what I think, and I would always say it's more about, the people and then the way that you feel about them. Where we are uncomfortable feels more like being incarcerated than where we are comfortable. And since that was what he knew in his life, and it wasn't in his case, it's different for Padma's book, for instance, he wasn't in a horrible place. He was actually well cared for there. And he was, there were people he avoided and whatnot, some people who would look at him in a cold-hearted way, but a lot of other ones really adored him and said, he's the mouse in the house, and that kind of thing. So of course he met with affection. And the other part of that was that, I think that innocence elevates all of us when we can observe it closely. And so if someone has had a brush, with not being very innocent or having made a life mistake, then, he's softened by the presence of that child.
Janae?
Yeah, I think we did cover it, but yeah, basically I think it made sense to have it to be the situation that it was, where she, where he's in prison and she's kind of on the outside trying to learn about him. And I really enjoyed using the letter format as a way for them to get to know each other. I know there's lots of different ways, as you're doing your research, you see like, how do you actually meet with a parent in prison? What are the different ways that people go about that? Visits are not always very easy. So yeah, I think like showing how they can connect over these letters and still be able to get to know each other and share with each other, I think was something that I was excited to do. Plus, I also just really enjoyed sending letters as a kid, and I think that's something that kids can, even though now and people maybe not be sending as much snail mail these days, although, hey, I get a lot of reader letters. So, I think it's fun to get mail and receive mail. So I figured it would be another way to kind of bring in the outside perspective. If you are somebody who doesn't know a lot about this topic, you can kind of relate to how exciting it is to receive mail from somebody. And and I think also too, Zoe being new at this, like she did not know her parent before. I think most people who have a parent in prison, they knew them and they went to prison after they'd already been raised by them for a period of time in a lot of cases. In this case, they're starting totally fresh. So it was a different way to go about it, but that was sort of my decision making on that.
Nora, anything? I know, if I remember correctly, Ruby was 3 when her mother went to prison.
3 or 5, I can't remember. I lost my mother at 3, so I probably made it 3. I'm not sure. But I think I knew right away, I was going to write about children who are, whose parents are on the inside, whose mother's on the inside. And I don't think I ever thought much about whether I was going to do that or not. I know you were going to ask what might have surprised us in our research or was before the time runs out. And I did want to touch on what really did surprise me in learning about this issue and doing all the research was that the mothers I spoke to and the women I spoke to, I just want to say before I say that, to Janae's story and I think also Lesley's too. And Padma, in your story, the father has committed this crime?
No, in the story, the mother is in jail, and I won't tell you whether she did it or not.
All right.
I can tell you, she is wrongfully convicted, and you know that pretty early. Yeah, you know that pretty early in the book. Because she's from a marginalized portion or a marginalized part of Indian society.
Yes, and I do want to make the point that, like everybody's speaking, I don't think we could ever speak about it enough. The disproportionate number of African American and Hispanic, it's enormous. When Lesley was talking about the "there by the grace go I," it's really "there by the whiteness go I," because I would have been. When I speak to kids or go into the prisons, I have to comment on that when I tell my life story, because I certainly would have not gotten away with what I did. But the women I talked to, and the other thing I very deliberately wanted to choose was that this mother has committed the crime. She has. And what I have learned since visiting prison is, I think of all the women I've met, only 2 have said they were innocent. Most of the women, all the women other than those, take full responsibility. And when they take that responsibility, that's when their children can begin to heal. And so for me, choosing the character I did was a way of writing into my own life, a way of sort of creating a situation where I could forgive my mother for what she did, through creating a character, and using Ruby as a way for me to sort of fictionally forgive my mother for what she did. And I'm not sure where I'm going with this, other than that's why I chose to have Ruby's outside and her mother inside. Hence the title, in fact, and I actually really loved this cover. One of the nicer ones. I can't tell you, maybe I shouldn't, but I had them actually ask them to round her nose because it looked so white. And every student I've ever had to read it sees themselves. They absolutely just see themselves, because there's nothing to delineate who they are, who she is.
Anyone else, something that surprised you when you were researching for the book or interviews that you conducted, Padma?
I do. It shocked me to see how young we incarcerate people in our country. In the United States, we send them off to jail, to prison when they're so young, and that just really shocked me deeply. And I think one of the things that I hope will happen from Born Behind Bars is that when someone reads it, it is an international perspective. And so perhaps I hope that they won't, be tempted to fall into political positions that they've taken a lot, or they've seen their adults in their lives take, but maybe examine some of the deeper issues about just, incarceration itself. What does it do to people? Do we need it? What, how else can we develop society? And why do people even commit crimes? What are the reasons that these things happen? And, to like look at all of that deeply, and also to think about how are we incarcerating people in our country? What can we change? What can we do better? Are we doing the right things when we send someone so young off to jail and that sort of thing? So I think that was probably my biggest shock when I read the research, or when I did, did so many different kinds of research when I read books.
That was beautiful.
Janae?
I was just going to echo what Nora said earlier. Just, as I was researching wrongful convictions, because that was sort of my point of inspiration, was, seeing how much race plays a part, how, like it really is a racial issue. And another thing that I used for research was the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay, which is on Netflix, I still believe. And that one, again, also just really made clear sort of how this has been like a systemic thing, ever since the 13th Amendment. So that was super interesting. And, things that I kind of maybe knew a little bit about, but like really once you kind of see it all laid out there, I think Padma said that earlier, like you just see it written down, you see the numbers and the graphs and everything. You're like, wow, like this is really an issue. So made me want to incorporate that into the book for sure.
I came across a couple of interesting things that were surprisingly useful to me that I just want to mention for anyone who's out there researching something. And I know we're really short on time, so I just want to quickly thank everybody for making this possible today. But what was interesting to me was there are handbooks that are given out to people who are submitting themselves for their to come pay their sentence, and what the handbook had in it was really interesting to me. I also found out that at many correctional facilities, residents are keeping blogs. And so I could read about their daily life. And that was amazing to me that was just right there and available. I also read one blog that had some information on what TV gets wrong about incarceration. And I felt like that was really important, so those were some odd items that I would have never expected. But as I began to look, there was also an article on architecture for facilities that made me realize that, not all are these, crusty, dank places. A lot of them are. But that, and even just the way minimum security is handled, there are some residents who swipe out for the day and go to their job and swipe back in by the end of the day by a certain time and go to their room. And yes, they are, the door's locked for the night. But I thought that was interesting because that seems like a good kind of way to pay back your debt. Yes, you are incarcerated, but maybe it would be better for you if we don't completely hold up your whole life in the meantime. So I thought that was sort of an interesting piece. So lots of little tidbits like that really engaged me when I was writing.
Interesting. Any sequels?
Oh, I get that question a lot.
I wasn't going to ask it, but I couldn't. Because with the new information that you find out when you're researching, did anybody do any research about life after for these parents?
There are some wonderful movies about it if people are interested. a woman made the film Mothers Behind Bars, I believe it's called. It's about Bedford, people getting out of Bedford Hills. It's not easy. And Our Children, that organization I mentioned before, works with women, Osborne Association, but also in New York City. It's difficult. It's really difficult. And I think, speaking to what Lesley said, and Padma said just now, if people could read our books and actually look at why we have prisons, what is it? Is it punishment? Is it keeping people because they're a danger to society? Clearly not, usually, most cases. Is it rehabilitation? We need to really, really look at our criminal justice system, because it is broken. It's racist, and it's a continuation of slavery in many ways. And if our young readers can read these books and open their eyes and think and talk, I forgot who was mentioning that, a little bit more. If one kid grows up to become a district attorney, a judge, a lawyer, wow, we've done something. I feel very strongly about this book. Is actually one of my least selling books. I don't think it's a topic people are aware of or interested in, sadly. And I'm sorry, because I wish it's really, really important. So thank you, Janae. Thank you for having, I'm telling you, thank you so much for doing this. I hope a lot of people hear.
Yeah, this is excellent. I mean, I'm so happy to be part of this with all of you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Lesley Roessing, for joining us.
Thank you so much.
I'm sure the teachers, librarians, and readers are looking forward to adding these 4 novels to their reading list. One thing I like to say, I'm always pushing book clubs, because I think reading books like this, topics that present challenges that adolescents are actually experiencing, are best read in small groups, where in safe spaces they can really have these conversations. So I would like to suggest that these 4 books together would make a good grouping for a class or a library book club reading. But thank you, everybody, for letting me join you and reread your books. And everybody will be very excited about Padma's book, which, do we know a publishing date? September 2021.
September 7th, I think, is the release date.
Okay. And the others are available, so we need to all get reading.
Yeah, I think mine is already on pre-order. It's so exciting for me. Although I haven't even held it yet.
I'm excited to read it. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.